$3. That is what one man believed a woman's life was worth on a scorching afternoon in Tombstone, Arizona, and he said the number out loud to a crowd, as if it were a fair and ordinary thing to say. Silas Bram had ridden into town that morning for nothing more than feed and rope. He left it having torn a legal document in half in front of half the county, having made an enemy who did not know how to lose, and having no idea that the woman he had just refused to let be sold would end up saving his life before the year was through. This is not a story about a man rescuing a woman. It is a story about what happens after the rescue, when the cost of one brave moment arrives slowly at your door over the following weeks, and someone has to decide whether courage was a single act or a promise they intend to keep. Stay until the end, because the person who actually wins this story is not the one holding the gun. Her name was Marisol Vega. She stood on an overturned crate on Allen Street with a black veil covering her face, not from modesty, but because it was the only thing left in the world that still belonged to her. The man conducting the sale called it a debt settlement. He called the gathered crowd a courtesy. He called $3 a reasonable price for a woman whose father had died owing money and left no one willing to argue on her behalf. Silas did not decide to intervene so much as find himself already moving through the crowd, 3 crumpled bills in his fist, before his mind had caught up with his feet. He pressed the money into the auctioneer's hand, took the bill of sale, and tore it cleanly in half. "Nobody owns another person in this town today," he said, loud enough for Allen Street to hear him. "Not for $3, not for 3,000. He did not yet understand who he had just humiliated, or what that man was capable of doing about it. To understand what Silas had actually walked into, you have to go back 18 months, before the fever that killed Marisol's father, before the auction, before any of it. Anselmo Vega had run a small freight line between Tombstone and the surrounding mining camps, a decent business built slowly and honestly, and 3 years earlier he had borrowed money to expand it from a man named Cornelius Bragg. It was an ordinary arrangement in a town where credit moved faster than trust ever could. When Anselmo died, the debt outlived him, and his brother Thomas, a frightened and pliable man left to manage what remained of the family's affairs, discovered something the rest of Tombstone never suspected. Bragg had never wanted the money. He had seen Marisol once, at her father's funeral, and had decided, with the flat calculation of a man who rarely failed to acquire what he wanted, that an unpaid debt was simply the cleanest tool available for acquiring her. Thomas, too afraid to refuse him, agreed to dress the arrangement up as a public auction so that what was actually a kidnapping would carry the appearance of a legal transaction. Marisol had learned of the plan only 4 days before the auction, with no money of her own, no family willing to intervene, and no standing in a territory where a woman's word meant little against a wealthy man's signature. The veil she wore that afternoon was not shame. It was the last small act of ownership she had left, the one thing about herself she could still choose to hide from a crowd that had come to watch her be priced like livestock. Her wound was not simply grief for a father she had lost to fever. It was something colder and more specific. The particular terror of watching every person who was supposed to protect her, an uncle, a town, a court, decide instead that her body was an asset to be liquidated. Silas carried a different wound entirely, one that had nothing to do with Marisol and everything to do with why he had pushed through that crowd without stopping to think. 4 years earlier, Silas had a sister named Ruth, who had married badly and quietly, and who had written to him in careful, hopeful handwriting asking, without quite asking outright, whether her brother might come help her leave a marriage that had turned dangerous. Silas had read that letter too late, on a ranch too far away, after telling himself for months that the trouble was not truly his to interfere with. Ruth died before he ever answered her. He had buried the guilt the way men of his kind usually did, by working harder and speaking less, and had sworn to himself in the silent year that followed that he would never again stand at a safe distance while someone was treated as less than a person. Silas and Marisol's wounds were not the same shape, but they fit together with an unsettling precision. He needed, more than he understood on Allen Street, to finally be the man who acted. She needed, more than she had let herself hope in 4 desperate days, for someone to act on her behalf without being asked twice. Silas brought her to his small ranch 8 miles outside town, not as a wife, not as anything with a name attached yet, simply because she had nowhere else to go, and he was not a man who could tear up a bill of sale and then walk away from what came after. The first days were formal and quiet. Marisol kept to the room he offered her, removed her veil only when certain she was alone, and spoke to him in clipped, careful sentences that revealed nothing. Silas gave her the same wide distance a man gives a spooked horse, understanding without being told that any pressure at all would undo whatever fragile safety she had managed to find. It was Marisol who broke the silence first, on the fourth morning, walking into the kitchen to find Silas covered in flour, wrestling with a batch of tortillas from a recipe he clearly did not understand. She laughed before she could stop herself, the first sound of real amusement she had made in 18 months. "You are doing it wrong," she told him. "May I show you?" It was a small moment, a cooking lesson between two near strangers, but it was the first time since her father's death that anyone had asked Marisol a question instead of handing her an arrangement. Over the following weeks, that kitchen became the place where the careful distance between them slowly wore away. She taught him the dishes her own mother used to make. He taught her to ride patiently on his gentlest mare, understanding that a woman who had just been auctioned like property needed more than almost anything to feel some control over her own movement through the world again. In the third week, she forgot to put her veil back on after washing her face and stood in the kitchen doorway barefaced in front of a man for the first time since the funeral, bracing for the calculation she had learned to expect from Bragg's people. Silas only said, "You've got flour on your cheek, same as me," and went back to kneading his dough. There was an evening near the end of the 5th week when Marisol found Silas alone on the porch steps after dark, holding a letter worn soft from folding and unfolding. She sat beside him without being invited and asked whose handwriting it was. "Ruth's," he said. "My sister, the last one, the one I never answered in time." He let her read it, and when she handed it back, she said only that showing up the second time, even after failing the first, was the whole of what one person could truly offer another. Silas did not answer for a long while. He simply sat with her in the dark, and something in him understood quietly that he had stopped merely protecting a stranger and had started loving a woman who could sit beside his worst regret without flinching from it. Neither of them yet knew that Cornelius Bragg had spent those same 5 weeks not grieving a loss, but planning exactly how he intended to reclaim what he still believed belonged to him. The first warning came 6 weeks after the auction in the shape of a cut fence. Silas rode out to check his eastern boundary and found 3 clean sections of wire severed deliberately, the kind of damage that told an experienced rancher precisely what message was being sent. He mended it without saying much, but began sleeping from that night on with a rifle within reach of the bed. The second warning came 2 weeks after that, when Marisol rode into town for supplies and was stopped on the street by a heavy-set man named Otto Rilke, one of Bragg's own. He did not threaten her outright. He only tipped his hat, said that Mr. Bragg sent his regards, and hoped she was settling in comfortably, and that he looked forward to discussing the matter of her father's outstanding debt at her earliest convenience. Marisol rode home faster than she had ever ridden, arrived pale and shaking, and repeated Rilke's words to Silas exactly as he had said them. Hearing it, Silas finally understood what he had actually done on Allen Street 6 weeks earlier. He had not simply stopped an unjust sale. He had publicly humiliated one of the most dangerous men in the county, in front of half the town, and Bragg had built his entire fortune and reputation on never once letting a public humiliation go unanswered. "The debt was never about your father's money," Silas told her. "You already knew that. I'm only now understanding what it means that I tore it up in front of him." Marisol answered quietly that men like Bragg do not lose $3 in public and simply forget it, because what he had actually lost that day was the appearance that he could not be defied, and that was worth far more to him than any sum of money. This, more than the torn paper on Allen Street, was the real turning point of the story, the moment the courage of a single gesture had to become something sustained. What followed were weeks of quiet, deliberate preparation disguised as an ordinary courtship. Silas taught Marisol to shoot, not as romance, but because he understood plainly that a woman who might one day need to defend herself should know how, and she proved steadier with a rifle than he had expected, hitting 4 bottles of 5 at 30 paces within a month, a fact she reported to him with the same quiet pride she once reserved for a well-made tortilla. She began telling him about her father's freight business, her mother's cooking, the genuinely happy childhood that had existed before the fever and the debt and the auction. He listened the way he had not let himself listen to anyone since Ruth's letters stopped arriving, fully, without rushing her toward the end of the story. One evening on the porch, rifle leaned against the wall beside him, he told her plainly that he did not regret tearing that paper for a single day, only every year before it when he had failed to act at all. What neither of them said aloud, though both of them understood it by then, was that Marisol had begun something of her own during those same weeks, something far quieter than target practice. She had started asking careful questions in town, comparing what she remembered of her father's own account books against the number Bragg had used to justify the auction. She had found 2 other families in Tombstone whose debts to Bragg had grown on paper in ways their own private ledgers never showed, and she had begun, patiently and without telling Silas, to build something that was not a defense at all, but a case. "I used to think the veil protected me," she told him one night. "I understand now it only hid me. You did not give me a veil, Silas. You gave me a fence, and now you keep mending it every time someone tries to cut it down. Don't thank me for staying then," he answered. "That is the only payment I am interested in." It was not a formal proposal, but she understood exactly what he was offering, and she took his hand and told him she intended to stay, debt or no debt, for as long as he would have her. In the days while the standoff was still only a rumor waiting to happen, Marisol worked in secret. In the hours Silas believed she was simply resting. She rode into town under the pretense of buying thread and flour, and instead sat quietly with the 2 families Rilke's warning had made her suspect, comparing torn scraps of memory against numbers that had never quite added up. One widow remembered her husband paying Bragg twice what the ledger claimed he still owed. A miner's son remembered a receipt his father had burned in anger, certain it would never matter again. Marisol wrote each account down in her own steady hand, tucked beside her father's original ledger in the trunk Silas had never once opened without asking, and told no one what she was building, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because she understood, better than Silas did, that a plan spoken aloud too early was a plan Bragg's men could still cut down like a fence line. She chose her moment carefully. She did not tell Silas about the evidence the night she gathered it, nor the next morning, nor the morning after that, because she needed him to keep believing, honestly and visibly, that his rifle and his fence mending were the only defenses standing between them and Cornelius Bragg. It was not that she doubted him. It was that she had learned, in 18 months of watching men decide her fate without asking her opinion, that the safest plans are the ones no one else can accidentally reveal. She practiced her account of the ledger the way she practiced her aim at the fence rail, quietly, alone, until the numbers came out of her mouth without a single tremor. By the time Cornelius Bragg actually rode into their yard, Marisol Vega was not a frightened woman hoping her husband's courage would be enough one more time. She was a witness who had already decided exactly what she intended to say and exactly when she intended to say it. Cornelius Bragg rode out to the ranch himself on a Sunday in late autumn, 4 armed men behind him and a folded court judgment in his coat pocket that he believed gave him every legal right to what he had come for. He did not dismount. He called Silas out by name, and Silas came onto the porch with Marisol a half-step behind him and a loaded rifle leaning just inside the open door. "Anselmo Vega owed me $400 at the time of his death," Bragg announced, "a debt his estate never settled. I have a judgment from a Tucson court authorizing its collection through whatever means I deem appropriate, including the labor of the debtor's remaining family. I believe that is the woman standing behind you." Silas told him she was not collateral, that he would tear up this judgment the same as he had torn up the last one, if that was what it took. Bragg only smiled and said that destroying his copy would change nothing, because the judgment was already recorded in Tucson. He had learned from Allen Street. This time his claim could not simply be refused. It was Marisol who stepped forward first, past Silas before he could stop her. "My father borrowed $300 from you, Mr. Bragg, not 400, she said, loud enough for the 4 armed men behind him to hear every word. "I have his ledger, in his own hand, in a trunk inside this house. I have also spoken these past 2 weeks with 2 other men in this town who borrowed from you on similar terms and watched their debts grow on paper in ways their own ledgers never matched. I did not tell Silas until I was certain I could prove it. I'm certain now. If you take me from this porch today, that ledger and those men's statements reach the territorial marshal in Tucson by morning, and you will be answering for fraud, not collecting on any debt." The yard went silent. Bragg sat his horse and looked at the veilless woman he had once dismissed as a line item, and understood, with the particular fury of a man badly outmaneuvered, that she had spent weeks quietly building a case against him while he was busy planning her capture. For a long, dangerous moment, nothing moved, and the outcome of that entire Sunday hung on whether a proud man would choose his pride over his own exposure. It was one of Bragg's own riders, a young man named Caswell, who finally broke the standoff, saying quietly but clearly that he would not raise a hand against a woman holding proof that could clear his own family's name along with hers, because his family's debt had ballooned the same unexplained way Marisol's father's had. It was a small defection, 1 man among 4, but it was enough to fracture the certainty Bragg had ridden in with. He looked at the carefully neutral faces of his own men and understood that the force behind him was no longer unquestioning. "This is not finished, Bram," he said, turning his horse. "It is finished today," Silas answered. "Ride out and take your judgment with you. Come within a mile of this ranch again, or of any man whose ledger does not match your own, and that paperwork goes to Tucson, regardless of what happens here." Bragg rode out with his men following, Caswell glancing back once with an expression that was not quite an apology but stood close to one. He returned alone on foot 3 days later and asked to speak with Marisol directly, telling her he intended to leave Bragg's employ entirely and give a formal statement to whatever authority she planned to involve. Not out of fear, he said, but because he had a young wife of his own and could no longer stomach what his silence had been protecting. Marisol's legs gave out the moment the riders had truly gone, not from injury, but from the simple weight of having stood perfectly still through a confrontation that could have ended in her death, and Silas caught her before she reached the porch boards and held her there a long time, the rifle still loaded and untouched behind them. The ledger she had kept eventually reached the territorial marshal, not as an act of vengeance but as quiet evidence in a case 2 other defrauded families joined within the year. Cornelius Bragg never went to prison. Men of his wealth rarely did in that territory, in that era. But the reputation he had protected more fiercely than any sum of money was permanently and publicly ruined, and within 3 years he had sold every holding he owned in Tombstone and left the territory for good, a quieter and far more complete defeat than any single confrontation on a porch could have delivered. Silas Bram and Marisol Vega were married the following spring in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Caswell standing among the witnesses at Marisol's own invitation. It is easy, looking back, to remember the torn bill of sale as the brave part of this story, and it was brave, but it was also, in its way, the cheaper part. A single dramatic gesture on a crowded street costs a man very little compared to what came afterward. The cut fences, the threats in town, the long Sunday when courage alone was not enough, and the actual rescue in the end came from a woman's patient, careful preparation rather than a man's impulsive grace. Silas and Marisol ranched together outside Tombstone for 34 years. She never wore a veil again, not out of defiance, simply because she no longer needed one, and she kept her father's real ledger in a small chest by the bed for the rest of her life, not as a reminder of what had almost been taken from her, but as proof of exactly what she had once been capable of saving. In time, their ranch became a quiet destination for other defrauded families across the territory, word passing mouth to mouth that the woman at the old Bragg dispute knew how to read a false ledger and would help for nothing in return. She told Silas once that she considered it a debt of her own, not owed to Bragg, but owed to whatever version of herself had once stood veiled on a crate on Allen Street with no one in the world left to speak for her. Silas never forgot the sound of that yard going silent, the way a single woman's steady voice had done what 4 armed men and his own loaded rifle could not, and he told the story often in later years, always the same way, always giving Marisol the last word in it. Their children grew up hearing 2 versions of how their parents met, The quick, dramatic one about a torn bill of sale on Allen Street, and the slower, truer one about a ledger kept hidden in a trunk for 6 careful weeks, and their mother always insisted, gently but firmly, that the second version was the one worth remembering. When Silas Bram died at 71, it was Marisol who read Ruth's old letter aloud at his graveside, the same worn pages he had once handed her on a dark porch, because she understood, as well as anyone alive, that the debt he had spent his whole life repaying was never really to Cornelius Bragg at all. It was to a sister he had failed to answer in time, and to a woman on a crate who had finally given him the chance to answer differently. So tell me honestly, was it the torn paper that actually saved Marisol Vega, or was it the ledger she kept hidden for 6 quiet weeks while everyone around her assumed the danger had already passed?